Good day, Grinder School. We're continuing on with our How to Master Heads-Up SNGs series with Part 5, Aggressions. So in this short, we're going to talk about aggression and how to effectively use it in Heads-Up SNGs specifically, but of course most of these principles, the general overlying principles, are the same as any type of poker. So we'll talk about a comparison of aggression versus passiveness, and using aggression, baiting aggression, and controlling aggression, which is generally the same. So to start out with, in general, you definitely are a player is definitely harder to play with the more aggressive they are. Even a really bad aggressive player will often go on incredible heaters, just because they'll often, when you're being aggressive and you're constantly jamming people or getting into big pots and stuff and forcing people to fold, you're often increasing your non-showdown winnings, even if you're playing poorly and taking a lot of unnecessary risks, particularly if you're playing against opponents that are tight-ish and aren't willing to gamble it up, right? So even a horrible, sputard, aggressive player will often have huge winning streaks from time to time, even if they're overall a losing player. And sometimes that could be frustrating even by itself, because often you'll get the money in good against a really aggressive, bad, spewy player, and they'll just catch up, right? So, and also because you're forced to play a little differently against them, you can often find yourself folding yourself out and getting a big chip disadvantage that ends up, even when you get your money in bad or good or whatever, you've already lost enough of your stack that it makes a huge difference. So in any day of the week, regardless of stack depth or type of hold'em that you're playing against, a passive player is always more welcome than an aggressive player. So when we decide to use aggression ourselves, we want to try to maximize the spots where we're going to get a lot of folds. We're also going to take advantage of any sort of aggressive image we have to get value from our value hands. And against competent players, we're going to balance those ranges. So we might be doing overbet jams as an example, both for value and as bluffs and spots to merge our ranges. Obviously, most of the money we make, though, is going to be against poor players, so we're going to have a tendency, except against stationy players, like against relatively fishy and predictable players, we'll be doing overbets as bluffs, unless we're playing against stations, and of course our overbets are instant value. So against another player that's being really aggressive, we can often bait aggression. One thing to note about that, a lot of mistakes that I see people do is that they'll suddenly limp a strong hand, even though they're playing against an aggressive player that's been jamming them up so often, or raising them, so that there's very little need to put your strong hands into a lower range, i.e. limping, versus a player that's going to be raising you up an awful lot. So keep that in mind. There's no need to get too tricky in baiting players, and aggressive players tend to get even more aggressive as stacks get shorter. Also, controlling aggression, similar to baiting aggression, but what I'm looking at here is sometimes the villain will be aggressive and you'll be trying to minimize their aggression with certain plays. I'll get into an example of each of these as we're talking in some very specific spots that we use aggression. But in general, you should always take into account when playing against an aggressive player how to basically control the pot, which is an underlying principle in all poker, pot control. So controlling aggression basically relates to that. So I'm going to start with an example of pocket pairs. Say you were 50 big blinds deep against a villain who's a reg, and has a 3-bet percentage of approximately 30%, 28%, say in this example. We have 5-5, and we open for our standard, a 3 big blind open. I know that I talked about earlier doing a 2.5 here, but we decide to open for 3 big blinds, and the villain 3-bets us to 9 big blinds. Here we shove. We could actually do this as a default against most players, because 50 big blinds deep, any pocket pair is usually going to be fine. Against the villain that's opening 28%, especially this deep, they are going to be pretty reluctant to call with a lot of the range, depending. And even when they do call, 5-5 actually stands up pretty good against that range. So as long as we can perceive having some fold equity here, and we definitely have that, we can definitely shove a small pocket pair here, 50 big blinds deep, perfectly fine. Now, against that same villain, if we were 20 big blinds deep, we might try doing something like this. So we have 5-5 again. We decide to limp, and the villain raises us up to 3 big blinds, and we decide to jam over top of them. So in this spot, normally when I get into my short stack portion of this series, I talk about how 5-5 here, 20 big blinds deep, would be a standard open jam. And that's simply because we want to maximize our fold equity. But against a villain that we believe is going to be isolating really light, this might actually end up making us more money in the long run. And it isn't necessarily something that I would do readless, but against somebody with any level of aggression, this isn't horrible. And again, 5-5 does pretty good against somebody that's going to bump up to 3 big blinds, especially if we believe that they'll have a bluff range for that. So those are some ways to keep in mind when playing pocket pairs, and maximize your fold equity with them. And they're relatively strong hands where you will do all right post flop, or getting them all in pre-flop, I should say. All right, so we're going to talk briefly here about my pet peeve hand, baby aces. In this scenario, we're 14 big blinds deep, and we decide to limp with ace-3 suited, and the villain jams, and we call. In spots like this, obviously, if you are limping ace-3 here, you're presumably trying to bait a villain into jamming into you. The problem is that ace-3 suited is at best a flip against the villain's entire range, including their bluff jam range. So we really want to avoid getting into spots where we're tricking the villain into jamming us with hands that have awesome equity when they would have just folded particularly this shallow. So you really want to avoid spots like that, and ace-3 suited is a really good example. Any sort of ace with a horrible kicker. Obviously, you know, we're not horribly done by against somebody that's going to be jamming their entire range here, but I think 14 big blinds deep is definitely too deep to be doing this with a hand like ace-3. We might try limp call at, like, to tell you the truth, I think that it's easily a jam, 14 big blinds and below. There are certain villains that might be jamming us any 3 cards that would fold to a standard open here, but that's a really specific read, and you shouldn't really count on it. And it's a pretty good example of how to induce poorly. So this is a spot we would not want to induce. The final example that I really want to talk about here is playing a hand in a more interesting manner, or a different manner than we might play against a standard opponent. Or a better example, this particular hand's middle pair, and normally there's a pretty standard line we would take here with middle pair, but we're 60 big blinds deep here, and it goes 3 big blinds call pre, and the flop is queen 7-2 rainbow. We have 8-7 suited with absolutely no flush draw on the board. So what are our options here? we can be check calling on this flop, we can be donking, and we could be check raising. Against a lot of villains, a check call here would be pretty standard with middle pair. However, this opponent's very aggressive, and there are a lot of cards that can come here that we're not going to really like seeing. And so we really won't be liking any sort of pressure that we get, and may have to fold a vast majority of the time with our middle pair here. Another option we have is to donk lead. Against a lot of aggressive players, though, a donk lead might actually work better as an inducing maneuver to get them to spew off at you, simply because a lot of players mistakenly think that all donk ranges are going to be weak. Or I shouldn't say mistakenly, because against a lot of players that's true, but in any case, we will probably want to avoid that. So that leaves check raising, which seems a little bit unusual with middle pair. But against the player, first of all, against any player, for the most part, we might consider check raising here with top pair or better. So there's certainly nothing wrong with us check raising with middle pair. Of course, we are losing value against a lot of the stuff that he would barrel with, but unfortunately, we'll be put into a lot of spots where he's going to just be able to barrel us off. So we can elect for a small check raise here, and a lot of the time, the villain will fold anything that doesn't hit this board, which is a vast majority of his range. So it's definitely worth considering. And I think against certain opponents, definitely the superior line to take. And I'd say that check call might be a close second, but the problem with it again is that there's a lot on the turn and river that could happen here that can really ruin our day. And what we want to accomplish here is, especially against a villain that's going to be calling with a wide range, or again a villain that's just going to flat when we check raise here. If they have a queen, we still have a chance to hit two pair on the turn, as an example. So we do have some a very small amount, but we do definitely have some outs here. We're essentially obviously just trying to take down the pot pre, though, and we're hoping not to get callers. Our hand is relatively weak, and it's unfortunate that we have to play it this way, since against some players, most players even, we would be check calling here with middle pair. But because it's such a weak middle pair, and because we can predict a vast amount of aggression from an opponent, it's definitely worth considering doing a check raise here, and I think against a lot of opponents the better move. Obviously, we're going to try to keep our check raise relatively small, and also we are definitely folding to any sort of jam this deep, so that's why we have the option to put a check raise in here. And it gives us the advantage of having an aggressive image, which we can take advantage of later. The only time against an aggressive or really aggressive player that I wouldn't do a check raise here would be if I thought that they weren't going to fold a vast majority of the time. So yeah, you're definitely going for the fold here. So one thing that I'll mention before ending this video is that a lot of mistakes people make when using aggression is that they decide to be inconsistent when using aggression, i.e. they'll try trapping with a pair of aces by limping in a spot that they normally wouldn't limp against a player that is often going to be raising them up or calling them, for that matter. So this is often unnecessary. Sometimes it's very effective, particularly when you're really, really low. But at the same time, in general, the deeper you are, the less correct it is. An aggressive player is likely to act out aggressively against a normal raise, so there's no need to limp in hopes of getting more aggression. Obviously, against a perfect player, the perfect scenario where a villain is going to excessively raise up your limps, like pretty much every time you limp, And then that would be an exception, but it's, again, one of those perfect scenarios, and you need a pretty solid read to do that. And also, while there's a lot of time when taking passive lines in order to encourage aggression is good, even with moderate hands, when you know a player is likely to attack a check call type line, thinking that you have a weak range, is likely to attack it pretty wide. While you can get value from doing a check call line for 3 streets, you must realize that you're often going to be using your whole stack, and sometimes it's way more worthwhile to try doing a check raise and take down the pot right away before things get a little bit nuts, particularly on dry boards. So that's just another example of how we definitely want to be trying to manipulate the aggression of the scenario, and to take advantage of any of our villain's tendencies, or try to control our villain's tendencies in order to maximize our profits in hand. So I'm going to end the video here. I hope that I left you guys with a lot to think about. If you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the forum, and I'll make sure to address them as soon as I can. Thanks very much.